I never expected her aunt to look at me that way, and when she whispered, "If you leave now, you'll never forgive me," still remember the first night I met her. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a casual evening at my friend's home. Laughter spilling from the dining room. The smell of roasted lamb filling the air. Glasses clinking as stories were traded back and forth. Everyone seemed caught up in their own rhythm, but I found myself distracted the moment she walked into the room. She was his aunt. Older, of course, but not in a way that distanced her. In fact, she carried herself with a kind of ease that drew people in without even trying. 40, maybe 42, with a natural grace that didn't shout for attention but commanded it all the same. Her presence shifted the air, softened it somehow. Her laugh wasn't loud, but low and warm, like she'd learned to keep it close to herself and share it only with those who deserved it. When she smiled across the table at someone else, I caught myself staring, almost guilty at how much her expression stirred me. Her eyes, clear, steady, the kind that looked right through small talk, found mine for just a moment. And in that instant, something inside me shifted. I sat among friends my own age, yet I felt out of place. Their jokes rolled over me, conversations blurred. Because she was only a few feet away, leaning slightly back in her chair, one hand loosely cradling her glass of wine, the other resting on the table in a posture both elegant and unguarded. She didn't try to be the center of attention. She didn't need to. The room was warm, filled with chatter and the occasional burst of laughter. And yet, every detail about her seemed amplified. The faint scent of jasmine when she passed behind my chair. The subtle way she tilted her head when listening. Even the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, revealing the sharp line of her jaw beneath the soft glow of lamplight. I caught myself leaning forward whenever she spoke, even if her words weren't directed at me. She had that rare gift, making every sentence sound as though it carried weight. Not heavy, but meaningful, as though she'd lived enough to know that words weren't things to be wasted. And I felt young, not in a way that made me ashamed, but in a way that made me realize just how much more of life she had already walked through. And yet, instead of feeling distant from her, I felt strangely drawn closer, as though her presence invited me to step into a space I had no business being in. I didn't plan to meet her eyes again, but when I did, she didn't look away right away. Just a heartbeat longer than courtesy required. A small thing, perhaps, but it set my chest stirring in a way I couldn't quiet. I didn't know it then, but that single glance was the beginning of everything. Ourself. I knew walking away was no longer an option. Later that evening, the noise of the house seemed to rise around us like a tide. Music played faintly from the next room. Voices overlapped in stories I couldn't quite follow, and laughter echoed against the high ceiling. Yet somehow, in the midst of it all, she and I found ourselves seated side by side on the edge of the living room sofa. It wasn't planned. I had stepped away from the table, needing air from the crowd, and when I returned, the only open space was beside her. She didn't shift away to make room. She simply looked at me with the faintest curve of a smile, as if acknowledging fate's small decision. At first, the conversation was polite. She asked about my studies, about work, about the casual details people usually ask when they meet someone new. But the way she listened was different. She didn't just nod absent-mindedly. Her gaze stayed steady, thoughtful, and I felt as though she was measuring not just my words but the truth beneath them. When I mentioned a book I had been reading, her expression changed instantly. "You've read that one?" she asked, leaning in slightly, her eyes bright with genuine curiosity. That small spark lit something between us. Suddenly the world outside our exchange grew faint, like the dim hum of a radio in the background. We spoke about literature, about the difference between stories that entertained and those that left you changed. She told me about the novels she carried with her on long flights for work, about the comfort of rereading certain passages when life felt unsteady. I listened more closely than I'd listened to anyone in a long time. There was a quiet strength in her voice, the kind of tone that comes from someone who has lived through disappointments but still chooses to believe in beauty. When she laughed at something I said, it wasn't loud or forced. It was soft, warm, like a candle flickering in the dark. The firelight across the room painted her profile in amber tones. I noticed the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, not as flaws but as gentle reminders of years fully lived. Her hand rested casually on the sofa's arm, so close to where mine was folded against my knee that I could feel the warmth radiating. For a moment, I had to remind myself to breathe. It wasn't flirtation, not exactly, but there was something unspoken in the space between us, a current of recognition neither of us named. I felt seen, not as the young man I often was to others, but as someone she was curious about in his own right. As the chatter swelled behind us, I realized I no longer cared what anyone else in the room was saying. My attention belonged to her, and hers, if only for these few minutes, belonged to me. And when her fingers lifted briefly to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, I caught the smallest glance in my direction, almost shy, as if she too felt something she hadn't expected. That night, in the middle of a crowded house, we carved out a quiet corner for two. At some point, the room grew too loud for me. The voices, the music, the constant interruptions. It was all a little too much. I slipped away quietly, stepping through the glass door that led out onto the balcony. The air outside was cool, almost startling against my skin after the warmth of the house. The night spread out before me in a wash of city lights, scattered like stars across the dark. I leaned against the railing, letting the silence settle into my chest, trying to steady the thoughts that had been restless ever since I met her eyes. But I wasn't alone. She was already there. She stood at the far end of the balcony, a shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, her figure outlined by the faint glow of the street lamps below. For a moment, she didn't notice me. She was gazing out at the skyline with a stillness that felt private, almost sacred, as if she were speaking to the night itself. When she turned and saw me, her expression softened. "Escaping too?" she asked, her voice low, colored by the hint of amusement that only someone who understood could carry. I nodded a little sheepishly. "It got too crowded in there." She hummed in agreement, her eyes returning briefly to the horizon. "I've always preferred silence over noise." The words lingered between us. She wasn't simply talking about the party. Somehow I understood that. I moved closer, careful not to intrude, and leaned against the railing a few feet away from her. The cool metal pressed against my palms. She shifted slightly, and in the narrow space of the balcony, her shawl brushed against my arm. The touch was nothing more than fabric, but it sent an unexpected shiver through me. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt deliberate. She seemed content to let the night fill the gaps, and I found myself mirroring her stillness, breathing slower, listening to the distant hum of traffic below. Finally, I asked, "Do you come out here often?" She gave a soft laugh, almost to herself. "Whenever I need to remind myself the world is bigger than the room I'm standing in." There was something in her tone, weary but hopeful, that made me look at her more closely. In the glow of the city lights, her face seemed both strong and vulnerable. She wasn't trying to be anyone else. She was simply herself, and somehow that honesty made her more beautiful than anything else could have. When I made a small joke about escaping family gatherings, she laughed, genuinely this time. And as she did, she placed her hand lightly on my wrist, just for a second. Perhaps it was instinctive and unconscious gesture, but the warmth of her touch burned into me. It was fleeting, but it left me stunned. That night air, the city lights, her hand on mine. It was as if time had paused just long enough for me to realize this wasn't something I could ignore anymore. The rest of the evening blurred into a rhythm of clinking glasses and half-heard conversations. I should have felt at ease, surrounded by friends, laughter circling the table, stories spilling one after another. But all I could feel was her presence, even when she wasn't looking my way. I thought maybe she felt it too. There had been something on the balcony. A spark, a stillness, an unspoken acknowledgement. But the closer the night moved toward its end, the more I sensed her pulling back. It happened subtly. She chose the far chair at the dining table when we sat down again. She kept her answers shorter when I tried to join the conversation. Her smile, the same one that had felt like a quiet secret between us earlier, became polite again, carefully neutral. I told myself I was imagining it, until her niece, no older than 20 herself, threw out a teasing remark across the table. "You'd better be careful," she laughed, glancing between us. "He's too young to even understand what love is." The words struck harder than I expected. A few people chuckled, but I froze, unsure how to respond. My chest tightened, waiting for her reaction. Her aunt, the woman who had leaned close to me, who had touched my wrist on the balcony, smiled faintly at the joke, but there was something in her expression that unsettled me. She defended me lightly, brushing the comment aside with grace. "I think he understands more than you give him credit for," she said, her tone even. But I caught it. The flicker in her eyes, the hesitation in her voice. She had built a line between us again. For the rest of the meal, she barely looked in my direction. She busied herself with conversation across the table, keeping her hands neatly folded, her posture straight, her gaze carefully elsewhere. I tried not to take it personally, but the weight of her distance pressed heavy on me. It was as if the connection we had just begun to discover had become something fragile, something she felt she had to protect, not embrace. The sound of cutlery against plates seemed louder than ever. Every burst of laughter around me reminded me of the silence between us. I wanted to ask her what had changed. I wanted to lean across the table, to break through the polite barrier she had placed between us. But I couldn't. Not there. Not with everyone watching. Instead, I sat in silence, pretending to follow the conversation, all the while replaying her niece's words in my head. Too young. Maybe that's what she had been thinking all along. When the plates were cleared and the room fell back into a softer glow of conversation, I caught her glance once more. Just a flicker. But this time, instead of warmth, there was a quiet wall behind her eyes. And I knew, without her saying a word, that she was retreating from something she didn't want to admit she wanted. The evening stretched late into the night. One by one, people began to leave, hugs exchanged at the door, laughter carrying down the hallway as coats were gathered. The once lively rooms grew quieter, the fire settling into soft embers. I lingered a little longer than I should have, waiting for something I couldn't quite name. But eventually, I realized I had no excuse left. My friend had already disappeared upstairs, his family preoccupied with clearing dishes. It was time for me to go. I found my coat draped across the back of a chair and slipped it on slowly, as though dragging out the moments. My hand was already on the doorknob when I heard footsteps behind me. It was her. She stood there in the dim light of the hallway, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders now, as if guarding herself. For a long moment, she just looked at me, not with the polite distance she had carried at the dinner table, not with the guarded smile she had worn earlier, but with something raw, something unsettled. "I should go," I said softly, almost apologetic. Her lips parted, but no words came at first. She stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence, hear the faint rhythm of her breath. Then, almost too quietly to catch, she whispered, "If you leave now, you'll never forgive yourself." The words hit me like a weight. They weren't playful, weren't careless. They trembled with honesty, like a secret she had carried too long. I froze, my hands still on the door, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. Her eyes glistened in the soft light, unblinking, searching mine. "I don't know why I'm saying this," she admitted, her voice almost breaking. "But I had to." I felt her hand then, light, hesitant, touch the sleeve of my coat, just enough to hold me there. Not gripping, not pulling, just a fragile plea in the form of touch. The hallway around us was silent, the distant hum of the city barely reaching through the walls. Time seemed to stretch impossibly thin. "I've lived long enough to know when something matters," she whispered again, steadier this time. "And this matters." Her vulnerability disarmed me completely. For hours she had kept her distance, drawing lines between us. Now those lines dissolved in the space of a single breath. I wanted to answer, to tell her that I felt it too, that I hadn't been able to think of anything else all night. But words failed me. All I could do was stand there, suspended between leaving and staying, between fear and longing. Her hand lingered on my sleeve, her gaze never breaking from mine. And in that silence I understood. She wasn't just afraid of losing me. She was afraid of losing herself to regret. And so was I. I don't remember letting go of the door. 1 second, my hand was gripping the knob, the next it was falling to my side, useless. All I could see was her. All I could hear was the echo of her whisper, still trembling in the air between us. If you leave now, you'll never forgive yourself. I should have left. It would have been easier. But the look in her eyes held me there, rooted like I had stepped into something larger than choice, as if my future had condensed into this single fragile moment. I stayed. She seemed startled when I did. Her shoulders lifted slightly, as though she had been holding her breath. I followed her into the living room, now hushed and dim. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, painting the walls with a faint orange glow. The house, once filled with laughter and voices, had grown impossibly quiet. We sat across from each other at first, both pretending to adjust ourselves, both too aware of the stillness. I could feel the weight of her hesitation, the conflict flickering across her expression. She looked down at her hands folded in her lap, then up at me again, as though testing whether I'd vanish if she blinked. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and fragile. "You make me nervous." I swallowed hard, not sure if it was a confession or a warning. "Why?" Her lips curved into something like a sad smile. "Because I haven't felt truly seen in a long time. And tonight," she trailed off, her eyes glistening. "Tonight I felt it. And that scares me more than I want to admit." Her honesty cut through me. I leaned forward slightly, elbows on my knees, trying to find the right words. "I don't want to pretend I don't feel something either. It's not simple. I know that. But it's real." The clock ticked faintly in the corner. She let out a shaky breath, as if those words had both comforted and unsettled her. When I reached across the small space between us, I didn't expect her to respond. But she did. Slowly, carefully, she placed her hand in mine. The warmth of her palm pressed against me, her thumb brushing softly over my skin in an absent, almost unconscious motion. It wasn't passion. It wasn't reckless. It was something deeper, the quiet recognition that both of us had been waiting for this, even if we hadn't admitted it out loud. We sat like that for a long time, the silence speaking more than words could manage. At one point, she leaned closer, and I wrapped my arms around her gently. She melted into the embrace, her forehead resting against my shoulder. I could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing, the way it slowed as though she had finally exhaled a weight she had been carrying alone. There were no declarations, no promises, just two people sitting together in the quiet, holding on to something they hadn't expected but couldn't deny. And for the first time that night, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. The night stretched into silence. We didn't speak much after that. We didn't need to. There was something sacred in simply sitting side by side, hands loosely intertwined, letting the quiet say what words could only fumble. At some point, the fire burned out completely, leaving the room lit only by the faint glow of streetlights slipping through the curtains. I must have dozed off for a few minutes, because when I opened my eyes again, she was watching me. Not with intensity, not with fear, just a soft, almost wistful look, like she was memorizing the moment before it slipped away. "Come," she whispered, rising to her feet. Her shawl fell from her shoulders, and she gathered it absent-mindedly as she walked toward the balcony. I followed without thinking, drawn to her as if my body already knew there was nowhere else I belonged. The night had shifted. The horizon was painted in faint strokes of blue and gold, the first signs of dawn spreading gently across the sky. We stood there together, leaning against the railing. The city below was quieter now, streets empty, the world not yet awake. She pulled her shawl tighter and exhaled, the cool morning air turning her breath into faint mist. "I don't know what happens after this," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the growing light. "I don't want to make promises I can't keep." I looked at her, the way the pale gold of sunrise softened the lines of her face, how it revealed both her strength and the vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal. "I'm not asking for promises," I said. I just don't want to regret not being here. Her lips curved, barely, into a smile. Tired one, but real. She nodded, almost to herself, and leaned gently against my shoulder. I felt the weight of her, the warmth of her presence, and for once, I didn't overthink it. I just let her rest there. We stood in silence, watching as the sky shifted from blue to pink, the first rays of sunlight catching on the glass of nearby buildings. Time felt different out there. Slower, quieter, as though we had stepped out of ordinary life into something suspended. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low and steady. Whatever this is, I don't regret it. Not a single moment. I squeezed her hand lightly, grounding us both. Then that's enough, I whispered. She didn't answer, but the way she leaned a little closer told me everything. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic vow, just the quiet understanding that something had begun. Something fragile, uncertain, but undeniably real. And as the sun rose higher, painting the world in light, I realized that I didn't need clarity about tomorrow. All I needed was this: her shoulder against mine, her presence beside me, and the promise of a moment we would both carry forward, no matter what the future held. It wasn't the end. It wasn't the beginning. It was simply us together for now. And that was enough. If this story touched you the way it touched me, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who believes in quiet, unexpected love. And if you want to hear more stories of age gap romance, forbidden attraction, and slow burn connections, make sure you subscribe, because there are many more moments worth telling.